relates to Bitcoin and other crypto assets. Are policymakers actually attacking Bitcoin? We know that it's the only decentralized, censorship resistant technology on the planet, but that doesn't stop them from trying to stop it, right? Well, we're going to find out more with our guest, George Leonardo from CapHillCrypto. But before I bring him on, let me tell you a little bit about our sponsor, Roundly X. Okay, folks, Roundly X. If you're not familiar with Roundly X, they allow you to round up your purchases on any of your cards that you have when you attach to their platform. They're going to let you round up those purchases with Satoshis. So whatever you do, go over to roundlyx.com and put in Bitcoin politics, and you're going to get $4 in Bitcoin. Okay, let's go ahead and get on with the show. All right, guys. Hey, this is Paul McNeil, the crypto curator, back on Thursday with Bitcoin and politics. And today I've got a wonderful guest that's going to come on the show. So happy to get George back on the show. Let's bring George in and let's start getting this conversation going. George, what's up, man?
Hey, Paul. Good to see you again. Thanks for having me on. Always a pleasure to be on Bitcoin Live. Appreciate you guys doing this.
Indeed. So what have you been up to lately, man?
You know, same old for the most part, just trying to keep up with all the madness when it comes to Bitcoin, crypto, and policy these days. But, keeps things interesting. But yeah, so for folks who might not be familiar, about a year ago, I built a website, CapHillCrypto, with the goal of making Bitcoin and crypto policy more accessible. Kind of the way I do that is, previously I worked on the Hill for Senator Cornyn before going to law school and briefly working on some litigation matters. And so I read a newsletter every Friday morning recapping what's going on the Hill. So you can get a summary of relevant hearings, new bills that have been introduced, that sort of thing. And also keep a legislative tracker where you can find all the Bitcoin and crypto related bills that have been introduced both in this Congress and also the 117th Congress. But again, the main focus is just trying to, keep folks in the loop. So anyone who's interested in knowing how DC is thinking about these issues, they can use the site. But then most recently, as far as what's new, just launched a new product, CHC Plus. You guys have probably all heard the term regulation by enforcement more than you want to at this point. But just seems to me like there's so much going on in terms of the courts and also the agency enforcement actions. So as a way to stay on top of that, I launched CHC Plus. We can find summaries of everything from like this week there was the oral arguments in Grayscale's suit against the SEC trying to get a spot Bitcoin ETF approved, CFTC versus UkiDAO. Go check it out, CHC Plus. There's a code up there so you can access it for free, take it for a spin, see what you think, and always feel free to reach out to let me know how I can make it better.
Awesome, man. Yeah, no, I love your website. For the folks that are listening, I met George last year at Bitcoin Miami 2022. It was a lot of fun. And when he told me what he was working on, I got super excited. And so his legislative tracker has helped me out a lot, keep up with the political landscape. This was in the 117th Congress. Now we're in 118th. So it's been a lot of fun using it. So with that being said, George, and while I have you for a few minutes, some of the bills that have been up on the Hill, can you sort of take us through, sort of what's, I guess, big, what's hot, that sort of thing?
Yeah, sure. So maybe before we get into bills, one thing, that I'm most excited about, and, the big development this year in the 118th Congress is there's a new subcommittee specifically focused on digital assets. And the reason why I'm starting there is because they're hosting their first hearing actually right now, where they're going to push back on some of the regulator attacks on crypto, which I believe is the title of the hearing. But yeah, so it's exciting to see that there's this committee specifically focused to these issues. And I think, one of the bills that might come up today was introduced this week, was called the Keep Innovation in America Act. And so that bill's important. I want to highlight that because you'll notice there are a lot of bills in legislative tracker and a lot of them won't get passed, right? And I know people get frustrated with Congress, but I think the Keep Innovation in America Act is one of the few that might have an actual shot, just because one, it is bipartisan, evenly bipartisan. There's 4 Republican sponsors, 4 Democrat sponsors, but the lead sponsor is Patrick McHenry, who's also the chairman of Financial Services Committee, which is obviously a very important role. And just to give a general sense of what the bill does, folks might remember a couple years ago when the infrastructure bill passed, there was a provision dealing with tax reporting requirements for digital asset brokers. The problem was the language that was included was so like ambiguous and broad that there's concern that it might actually include Bitcoin miners, proof of work validators, even certain software developers. And so this bill tries to fix that and really narrow the scope. I think the best evidence that there needs to be a fix in place is that the person who sponsored the original definition of broker, Senator Rob Portman, who I believe is retired now, he actually, at the end of the last Congress, sponsored a bill himself to correct the language. So, I'm optimistic that, since there's bipartisan support, a fix will pass. And that was introduced that week. So figured that was a good place to start.
Yeah, no, you're right. That is a great place to start, and I'm glad to see, and hopefully the people watching this understand this too, because in this political environment, it's so easy to be partisan about almost everything, and so it's actually very refreshing to see that we have some bipartisan support on things, and the fact that they're coming together on this bill should say a lot about what can get done. I think it was Jon Stewart once said, and it was during one of his, rallies in DC. He said, as much as we don't like Congress, don't like government, but there are men and women that go to work every day to get stuff done. And so this is an example of them coming together to try and get stuff done.
Yeah, it's a good point. And that's partly why the hearings are important too, right? Because you're not always going to be able to get bills through, but people do pay attention to what members of Congress have to say. And so hearings can be a good way to, kind of change the narrative, right? I feel like so often in the news, the stories have been so negative, especially since the FTX collapse earlier this year. And so, having a committee with, not just Republican members, a lot of the members on the committee, I think, are pro digital assets. They want to see innovation in the space. So it'll be interesting to see that hearing and maybe, kind of launch a counterattack, so to speak, on this narrative and really hear some stories about the positives of the industry and some of the good stuff that's going on and why, this regulation by enforcement can, some of the concrete effects that it has in terms of affecting innovation and jobs and that sort of thing.
And, I'm glad that you reiterated that again, because I think sometimes we don't realize that there are pro-crypto legislators that are up on Capitol Hill. And we have to remember that it takes a majority of Congress to get things passed through. So a lot of stuff that's come about and things that you see, the bills that come out, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. But the fact that we know that we do have some advocates up on Capitol Hill for crypto, and I'm hoping Bitcoin specifically, it's going to be neat to see how this sort of come to pass. So what else is shaking up there?
So the other thing I want to flag, especially on Bitcoin Live, try to keep the focus on Bitcoin. Unfortunately, not a positive to bring up, but was it Tuesday? There was a hearing in the Senate, and again, the Senate we got a little more concerned, right? The House is a lot more positives to look at, in addition to the hearing I brought up in the new committee. But in the Senate, there's a few more crypto skeptics, and specifically this week there's a hearing targeting proof of work mining. The hearing really it was put on by chairman of the subcommittee, Markey from Massachusetts. And you could tell he's got a new bill that would require, it says crypto miners, but it's really, it's going to be Bitcoin miners whose operations use X amount of energy will have to report emissions data and energy usage data to the EPA. And so the majority of the focus of the hearing, at least on the part of the Democrats or the majority in the Senate, was to highlight the energy usage of Bitcoin. Thankfully, ranking member Ricketts on that committee, who's a new member from Nebraska, advocated for some of the benefits of Bitcoin, and which I thought was interesting. Without getting too much into the weeds of like how proof of work mining operates, he kind of drilled in on specific examples in his home state of Nebraska of how job creation, and not just any jobs, like high-paying jobs, and in rural areas, which don't always have the same economic incentives for companies coming and invest in. So it's good to hear like a new member coming out, and it looks like we'll have another advocate, at least on the Senate side there. But also Senator Lemus came out and made some really interesting points, I thought, particularly in regards to the dangers of the government coming in and basically deciding for individuals what are and what aren't like efficient uses of energy, right? And I think that was kind of the main criticism of the bill. Is you're kind of singling out proof of work, right? There's a lot of different industries out there that use a lot of energy, but you just come after Bitcoin mining specifically and decide we don't think that's a valid form of energy use. I think is what's most concerning about the legislation and the way they talked about it at the hearing generally.
You know, George, one of the things that always puzzles me when we're looking at something that, I don't know, to me is sort of common sense. Listen, we've got the Bitcoin Mining Council run by Michael Saylor, and I think it's like 50% of the mining companies. Every quarter, they release a report on Bitcoin mining. Obviously, some of the talking points they say is like Bitcoin mining is using like 0.1% of the global energy. And so it's like it's a no-brainer that it's really not that bad. But for some reason, these politicians, they tout this stuff. And I don't know if you can say this or if you can't say this, but why do politicians take these stances when it seems like something is so clear the opposite way? Is there a reason why they do that?
So I think, taking a step back, I think that what it comes down to, right, is like, especially when it comes to environmental issues, right? That's something that's easier for these members, particularly, maybe the older members, to wrap their heads around, right? Instead of like really getting into the weeds of, how it operates, and not just the how, but like the why, right? Like proof of work does use a lot of energy, right? But like they never got to the point of like why, like by design, that might have some value. And so I do agree, like the frustrating part for me is when you hear members talk about it and you feel like there's not that full understanding of it, but yet they're already moving forward with their ideas. And so I think why like this attack on proof of work from an environmental standpoint is appealing to certain members is, one, it's easier for them to just wrap their heads around in message. But two, yeah, politically, like there are a lot of people out there who are very passionate about the environment. And so this can be kind of their way to, hop on and do something about crypto in a way that's like less controversial with their base. And, that happens on both sides as well. That's why, you think like Republicans, you could say, would just, kind of instinctively pivot to jobs and innovation type talking points. And so I think part of it is just a messaging aspect of it where you kind of keep everything high level. And that's why it's so important to have advocacy groups. I know Satoshi Action Fund was on the Hill recently and has been making the rounds in the States. You brought up Bitcoin Mining Council. But we've talked about this all the time. There's so much going on, so many issues for these members to stay on top of. And so, in their defense, kind of, it can be hard to get in the weeds on every single issue. And so it's just really important, in particular, you get their staffs up to speed on more of the nuanced details. Because at the end of the day, honestly, a lot of those details won't make it all the way up to the member, or at least to the point where it's coming up, in hearings and in public statements.
Yeah, my good friend Matty Sat said Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. So I'm assuming he's pointing to something that has to do with maybe the banking industry is pushing this agenda for his ESG deal, which I really don't know who started and who began to push ESG so hard and why they decided to pick Bitcoin mining of all things to push it on, when Bitcoin mining actually helps the energy grid here in Texas. We're seeing it happen up in New Hampshire. They're looking at it. Missouri, Massachusetts, I think, or Missouri, not Massachusetts, Missouri and Mississippi are looking at protecting Bitcoin mining and things like that. Again, when that much movement is going on an issue like this, it's weird to see one particular candidate or a policy leader push so hard the opposite direction. Seem like that they would get it, but maybe not.
Well, I think that's why, the states, it's important. You brought up a lot of different examples of the states, and because they play a big role in kind of the energy usage in their own states. But, those are good examples. I know a lot of times members will, whatever issue it is, they'll to have concrete examples at the state level of how that works. But I think you make a good point. It should be whatever issue, you got to look at the whole picture, right? And, you could say energy usage, but that, you got to, where is this energy coming from? How much of it is renewable, if that's what you're looking at. And I thought Senator Lummis brought up a really good point where she brought up like, well, what about like electric vehicles? They have to draw power from somewhere, and to charge them, they might be drawing it from coal powered plants. So why not also have them disclose information, right? And, you can kind of see like, where does that end when, the government rather than the individual is saying this way is more efficient, so we're going to favor that type of energy usage versus another. And, I don't know, that was kind of my sense of the hearing. And I thought, thankfully, there were arguments presented on both sides. So we'll see. Definitely something to keep an eye on, though, because, that hearing focused on legislation. More recently, earlier this year, Senator Warren led a letter, and she sent one earlier last year as well, to the agencies, and basically saying you don't need to wait for Congress to do anything else. You have the authority to start requiring some additional reporting requirements. So, you got to keep an eye on Congress, but you also got to keep an eye on the agencies, because I don't think that issue is going away. I think, especially progressives are going to look to target proof of work mining under the concerns raised by environmental concerns.
So you think if this proof of work type of a bill came out, do you think it'll get past Congress, or do you think that's something that's...
No, I don't. I can't see that bill passing the House. I mean, maybe Senator Mark is like the chair of that subcommittee, and maybe he can get it out of that committee, but I'd have a hard time, even if it does somehow make it through the Senate, which is unlikely in itself, because the Senate, you need 60 votes due to certain procedural issues to get things through. Most of the time there are exceptions. So that's why I kind of say, like, maybe you don't have to worry about that one. That's more just like, a narrative we got to watch out for. But the regulators, if they come out and say, oh, we don't need that authority, we can, through regulations or, guidance, push for more disclosures. That's kind of another thing you got to keep your eye out for.
Right. A little inside baseball, again, don't know how much you can sort of say to this. Is there normally on some issues a lot of pressure from the party itself on some of the legislators to go one way or the other? How does, I guess sort of, how does it work when you're trying to build consensus in Congress around the issue? Are they like promising things on the backside? Are they like, patting on the back over here? How do you get someone to agree to support this stuff?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Just like, I guess, generally, like the consensus process, usually it starts with, it's like at the staff level where you'll know. So example, like Senator Lummis, right? Everyone knows she's, pretty out there in terms of supporting Bitcoin and crypto generally. So if you're working on a bill in someone else's office, you probably want to start with her staff, get her thoughts, there's a lead ally there. So you kind of start internally and then build your way out from there. Just based on, you're always meeting with members of staff, especially on your issues, right? Like when I worked on healthcare, there was always healthcare lunches, healthcare briefings, the committees that have jurisdiction, you're always meeting with these same people. So you get a pretty good sense of who would be your likely co-sponsors. And then terms of like reaching across the aisle, it's the same thing. Usually there's one, these bills, a lot of them draw on previous bills. So you can kind of see who's sponsored them in the past and build it out that way. And that's where also like the advocacy groups come in. They might have information. Oh, we've been talking to this member. They have some interest on this particular issue. So it really varies. But then more broadly, you asked about like the party in general. That does come in, especially in terms of setting the schedule for what gets votes, where leadership kind of has an idea, a rough idea of when things will get votes and how they want to move things. Committee chairs have a big role in the schedule as well. And so, everything, it's facts and circumstance dependent, but yeah, for the most part, it's, you're just kind of scrapping to get support any way you can.
There was another one, Keep Your Coins Act. What is that about? Or did you mention that earlier? Or?
No, so Keep Your Coins Act is another bill. I'm glad you brought that up. I don't think that's been introduced yet this Congress, but it was listed in the hearing memorandum for the Senate Finance Committee hearing today. And that one's big, I think, for Bitcoiners in particular. It's all about protecting self-custody, right? So I believe it was issued in like response after like the Canadian trucker incident, right? Where like banks in Canada, or people found like the bank's account frozen if they donated to the Canadian truckers who are protesting. And so, kind of as a way to make sure that individuals have access to like their own money, or in this case, their own crypto. I think the way it does it technically is it prevents any agency from issuing a rule that would, limit or impede anyone's right to self-custody their own assets.
Yeah, no, and that's a sentiment I'm seeing, especially after FTX, that's really blown up in the industry of self-custody. And there are a ton of ways people can self-custody their assets. Unchained Capital is one of them. They do a lot of sponsoring of our meetups here in Dallas. But it's important that people realize that self-custody is not as hard as you think, specifically when you have organizations like that. But even if you don't have an organization like that, it really behooves people to take the time to learn how to self-custody and actually self-custody their money, because we're starting to see they're coming out with all kinds of regulation. Who knows what's going to happen? And to sort of wrap this thing up, speaking of regulation, what do you think about the SEC, CFTC scuffle that's going on, trying to see who's going to be able to regulate stable coins or regulate Bitcoin or Ethereum? And any thoughts on that? And how do you see Congress looking at that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, Congress is going to step in. They have the power to make the clear guidance, right? And to say who has authority over which. That's the only way that this is going to come to, an actual conclusion. Congress get the power. They need to come up with some definitions, lay out the authority, say, who has jurisdiction over what, and that will go a long way. But until then, I mean, it seems like every day there's a new interview with, Tier Gensler saying, there's jurisdiction over these assets. And then there was a hearing earlier this week, as I think he brought up, with the CFT commissioner talking about what he thinks he has jurisdiction over. And, until Congress lays out something clear, and, you can honestly keep arguing it, right? Like, you can make arguments. That's what lawyers do. I'm sure they'll find ways under the current laws to say this one's a security, this one's a commodity. So we really need Congress to step in and provide that regulatory clarity.
Yeah, and I know you got to go, but one last thing before you do go, that new draft bill that's by Christian Gillibrand and Lummis that they've at least indicate they're going to bring out again is the Responsible Financial Innovation Act. Any thoughts on that, where that's going to go? I think they said something like April it's going to come out.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to see it. I know they've been working hard since they introduced it last year, really to solicit more feedback, improve it. And ties in nicely to your previous question, because one of the things I've noticed them saying in interviews is that the last version, they weren't able to really get, full consensus on certain pieces of legislation. And so they left some language open, or to leave discretion to the agencies to kind of fill in the gaps. But it sounds like, this time around, after having some more time, getting some more input, they'll, tighten up the language a little bit, and hopefully provide, even more clarity. The thing that's, exciting about the Lummis-Gillibrand bill is, at least as it was last year, there's so many, different aspects of it. There's some, tax issues, regulatory clarity, stable coins, research, so many different components. Hopefully, get the ball rolling, getting people talking about these issues, and excited to see the new and improved version.
Yeah, me too. All right, George. Hey, thanks for coming on. Tell folks where they can reach you, follow you, get your information. Who is it best for, that whole 9 yards?
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much for having me on. Always a pleasure to be on. Sorry this had to be a quick one, just crazy times these days. But yeah, CapHillCrypto.com, same Twitter handle. Please reach out. Always happy to talk to people interested in the space. But yeah, thanks so much, Paul. Thanks, Bitcoin Live. Really appreciate you guys. And yeah, look forward to coming on again soon.
Awesome, man. Have a great day. Have a great weekend too.
All right. Peace, guys.
Awesome. Take it easy. Yeah, George is top notch when it comes to this political stuff, guys. Listen, I'm telling you, he is the authority when it comes to knowing where to understand what's happening on Capitol Hill. If you really want to know what's going on the Hill, you've got to go to CapHill Crypto. Look at that legislative tracker, because one of your members, very well one of your representatives, might be co-sponsor or sponsor on a bill, and you need to lend your voice to let them know you support it or that you don't support it. And so keeping this resource at your fingertips is going to be critical. My good friend Maddie Satz earlier had said, we're talking about our good friend Lizzie, and I didn't want to get too much into Lizzie George, but I think Maddie Satz is right? But Lizzie Warren, she's bad for Bitcoin. As a fact, one batter, he said she's bad for the environment as well. I would have to agree with him, because again, this is my frustration I have. Elizabeth Warren, you're not crazy. You know what you're saying is not true. Bitcoin is not ESG problem. It's just not. So I hope they cut that out. In addition, he goes on and says she funded the Silvergate issue, all right? And she got big banks lobbying behind her, and I do believe that's true. And that's one of the things I wanted to get George to sort of say, but he wouldn't say it. I didn't want to press him too hard on this. But listen, these members are being supported by the opponent of whatever it is that they're pushing. And so it's just, it's unfortunate, or they're supporting it. So yeah, I won't go down that rabbit hole too much, but leave it to Maddie Satz to bring the fire on my show. Thanks, Maddie. I appreciate that, buddy. Hey, listen, I want to bring my website because I do want to hit the top 3 news articles that was covered today. Just want to mention them. It is really all about Silvergate, to be honest, right? Silvergate's shutting down. They voluntarily said they're going to shut that crap down. And the reason that they're shutting it down is because everybody's leaving. That was the second story. Marathon's like, buy Silvergate. And if I'm correct, and I don't have it up right in front of me, which should, there was another one that said goodbye to Silvergate too. So people are leaving Silvergate left and right. It's a sinking ship, and everyone's jumping off board. And then last but not least, JP Morgan, their relationship with Gemini is still intact. Folks, do not listen. Pay attention to what you read and what you believe. Listen, I'm guilty of it too. I'll see a headline come across and I jump on it. Come to find out later, it's not true. They came out initially and said Gemini and JP Morgan are splitting, they're cutting ways. And it makes it look like there's an attack on on-ramps, but it comes out that's not really the case. Now, I say that, but we know what happens. You start hearing this stuff, they come out and deny it, and then later it's proven right. So again, be careful what we read. Let's not jump to conclusions. Let's not get crazy. In addition, our video of the day was Altcoin Daily talking about CBDCs. I know my producer Nick is all over this. He is nodding his head left and right, up and down, going crazy, going, hey, buddy, told you this CBDC stuff is scary. So you're definitely going to watch that out because that is a threat to your financial freedom. And last but not least, Bloomberg Crypto got to talk to Circle CEO Jeremy Allaire. Folks, if you're not paying attention to Circle, you really should. They're the ones who run USDC in conjunction with Coinbase. And guess what? I think that's going to be the digital dollar. Don't believe me? It was Circle that ratted out BUSD and Paxos and got that whole train started. So if you think they're not getting rid of the competition, they're going to have a hard time getting rid of Tether, but USDC is going to be moving up the food chain. All right. Hey, listen, guys, I'm going to make this short and sweet today. I do want to talk about, though, one other thing. It's WooBits. If you guys know, throughout the day, I am spending my time on WooBits. I've sort of left Twitter because Twitter has gotten really political, toxic. Everyone's just screaming and yelling. It's just total drama. I went to WooBits. Why? Because WooBits is real people, no bots, not yet. They're making real connections and having real conversations. It's a really, really good community. Get so much engagement from what I have. And right now they've launched a new feature called price calls. So if you're like me, I always like guessing what the price of Bitcoin is going to be. So you click new post, you can click price call and you can put in your price call for a day, for a week, for a month. I think it may just be for a day. I think it's short-term price calls. But basically I can say, hey, I think Bitcoin's going to the moon tomorrow. And either I'm going to be proven right or wrong. Now, I'm hoping that they will start curating that and keeping a running tab on who's right and who's wrong. That way, you know not to listen to people like me. Or better yet, as the good video says from Mark Yusko, whatever you do, do not take financial advice from Matty Sachs. So hopefully Matty Sachs will get on there and he'll do a price call. That'll be phenomenal. See if he's right to track his track record. That'll be a lot of fun. All right, folks. Last but not least, Bitcoin Live is an amazing family of shows. You know I have mine, Bitcoin Politics, Bitcoin and Freedom. But in addition to that, we've got other shows like Gingerly. We've got 3D Changes Perspective. And best of all, we got Beyond the Block with Matty Sachs. Guys, he's bringing the heat. And if you haven't watched the show, you've got to watch it. It's combined with not only good information, it's also got a lot of humor to it. Matty Sachs does it better than anybody else. And if you're not familiar, Matty Sachs is also the voice on the radio up in Seattle. So you got to listen to his radio show. You can jam to some music. Then catch him on Sundays at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time when he has Beyond the Block on Bitcoin Live. And last but not least, of course, our wonderful host, or not host, but our producer, Nick. He runs the Bitcoin Live show. And his show is filled with a lot of NFT information, things that you just want to know. So we've got a full swath covering this space. You're going to get really good information when you listen to Bitcoin Live. So whatever you do, please, on the video right now, whether you're watching live or watching a rerun, click the like button, hit the subscribe and the bell for notifications. That way, when we come on, you're going to know it. Hey, I'm always here 1 p.m. on Thursdays. Matty Sachs is 1 p.m. on Sundays. And then we've got Gingerly, I think they're like 12 or 11 o'clock Central Standard Time on Sundays. So, yeah, you get a really good sweep of the shows. But all that information is on our YouTube show. And again, folks, thank you for tuning in to listen to this live. Thanks, Matty Sachs. Thanks, everybody else that listen live. And until next week, I'm going to see you guys later. Bye.
And just one parting thought, the best financial advice I can give you is whatever you do, do not listen to